Good morning. It is so good to see you all here today. I was trying to think this morning how long it's been. It's at least February 2020, I believe, since we had one of these in person. So thank you all for coming. My name is Joan Putney. I'm the executive co-chair of the Women of St. Stephen's, and we are very fortunate today to have with us these fine folks. If you have any questions you think you might want to ask, we have note cards that you can fill out, and we'll get them to them. And now, I've asked Pat if he would lead us in prayer.
The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. We give you thanks, O God, for your many blessings. We give you thanks for this parish family, these folks who are seeking you and seeking to know you more deeply and to know one another more fully. We thank you for the women of St. Stephen's, for their fellowship, their ministry, their support of this place. We ask that you would bless them as they seek to do your will and your work. We ask that in all things, each of us could be more fully engaged in your ministry and more deeply ensconced in your love. Bless us this day as we get to know one another better. And in all things, keep our eyes fixed on you through Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
And now I will have the program chair, Marilyn Kirkpatrick, come up and introduce. Thank you.
Gosh, it's great to see everyone again this morning. Am I speaking into the mic okay? You know me and my soft voice. It's wonderful to be here and to especially be here with Will, John, Cate, and Pat. There are so many things we don't know about each other. And so we thought this would be a great opportunity to find out a little bit more fully who these fine people are with their collars and without their collars. Now, this morning I wore maple leaf earrings because most of you don't know that I was born in Canada, and next Monday will be Canadian Thanksgiving. Yeah. And so I was celebrating in advance Canadian Thanksgiving and hoping that we'll all have Thanksgiving in a more regular version this year. Doing it safely and with family and friends. But I did want to give us this opportunity to find out what surprises St. Stephen's has brought to our clergy and what they like to do. I know Cate rides her bike every once in a while. You may not have seen Cate ride her bike. And so anyway, it's just an opportunity to get to know each other better and to give thanks for their presence. Just wanted to highlight November, and that is an evening program so that women and men that are unable to come during the day can come to our evening program, which will be this wonderful program given by Reeves Folks Carol about our World War II generation, the men and women who served us during World War II. And so please put November the 2nd on your calendar. And now I'll let you take over and collect the cards and bring them up to you. I'd be happy to. Yeah. Thank you for being here. It's incredible.
Well, we are glad to be here. More cards. Excellent. And just to clarify, if you have not gotten a card and you'd like to send a question up, these questions really are intended to be about really these clergy. You can ask anything about me, but I'm not very interesting. So you can you can ask questions of or about these three. And I wanted to start by saying, just telling you that I've been doing work in the church for a long time, including 10 and a half years on 2 different bishop staff and 2 different dioceses. But I also do a lot of work with intentional clergy wellness program called Credo. And so I have gotten, over the last 10 years, to meet lots of Episcopal clergy through these week-long retreats/seminars that I participate in teaching about vocational things and so forth. And I don't want to embarrass these 3, but I'm telling you, these 3 are the cream of the crop, and you should be very blessed to have them at St. Stephen's. So it was important for me to say that on the front end so that you can now try and figure out why they're the cream of the crop in the way that we taught this morning. So what we're going to start out by doing is asking each of them to take about a minute and a half to just tell you a little bit about where they're from, where they grew up, kind of their history in the church, just little bits and pieces. And we're going to bounce around a little bit, and I'm going to sort of poke them when they're maybe not saying enough or saying too much, but we'll try and cover all the bases. So why don't we start with Cate? Cate, tell us about where you grew up and anything else to get you to right here.
My name is Cate. I grew up largely in Delaware, in Wilmington area, though I moved quite a bit before I was 11 and was born in Florida, which is where my mom lives now. I went to McGill University for undergrad, so I too love Canadian Thanksgiving. And my family sort of adopted Canadian Thanksgiving as part of our own holiday pattern. My dad really loved the chance to eat a big meal, so we started doing that every year. And then I moved to Chicago for the Episcopal Service Corps, which is like AmeriCorps but run through the Episcopal Church, where I was a hospital chaplain for some time before going to seminary at Yale Divinity School. And I graduated last year, right at the beginning of the pandemic, and moved here in June of last year, which was exciting to do in such an odd time. So this is the farthest south I've ever lived, and I didn't know if I would like it, but I love it. I secretly, I think, was kind of made for this kind of, I always get nervous about talking about what I perceive to be Southern culture in front of Southern people, but I really like it, and I think it's great. And people are nice here, so just very glad to be here. Yeah.
Okay. What do you do for fun?
I ride my bike. I love to cook. I almost went to culinary school instead of seminary, but here we are instead.
Tell the thing that Jeff told.
Oh, my bishop of, I was out of Chicago, and the bishop of Chicago at the time was named Jeff, and he said, Cate, you can be a priest who cooks, but it's really hard to be a chef who's also a priest, and I won't ordain one of those. And I thought, well, that's very clear. So here we are. But I love to read. I've been reading a lot of novels lately. I'm reading one about vampires right now, and just hanging out with friends, playing board games. Yeah.
Good. John?
Hello, everyone. So I'm John Jenkins, and I was actually born in North Carolina, despite some of the reporting when I first arrived that I'm a native Virginian. I'm letting the cat out of the bag. I actually am a native North Carolinian. Born in Greensboro, and baptized with the trial use of the Easter Vigil in 1975.
Wow.
And my father baptized me because he was an associate priest at that time. But his first parish as rector was in South Boston, Virginia. It's a little tobacco town in Halifax County. That's where I grew up. And went to VMI, as a few of you know, and many of you know maybe. But class of 97, Raw Virginia Mill. And, but really wasn't too sure about my vocation or what to do after that. And I ended up meeting a wonderful woman, Bess Turner, and we got married. I moved here. I lived on Bromley Lane at the 5000 block for a few years, about 20 years ago. And Claudia was actually my rector at Holy Comforter, and it was a very special time. Anyway, ended up moving back to my ex-wife's hometown in Montgomery, Alabama, and spent 12 years at St. John's in Montgomery before engaging with the call to go to seminary. And after graduating from Swanee in Tennessee, ended up in Augusta, Georgia, very unexpectedly. So this is the furthest north I've lived. But I have Canadian cousins. My father's sister married an Englishman, and they live in Toronto, and I've been to Niagara Falls and a few things like that. So So you should try the Deep South sometime. That's quite different.
Yes. Indeed.
Yeah.
What do you do for fun?
Well, I didn't really realize part of the reason that I think I went to Swanee was the nature element of that. Like it is on one of the second largest campus of American colleges. Berry College is larger, but Swanee is far more beautiful. 16,000 acres, and I love trees and I love being on a trail. I don't do a lot of camping, but there are not many weeks there's rarely a week that goes by that I don't go to a park and walk and take photography, take pictures, a lot of pictures, and am really enjoying the James River park system and being outside. So it may not be like exciting fun, but there is something that feeds me outdoors that I can't live without.
Cool.
Yeah.
Will?
Right. I'm Will Stanley. I have zero connections to Canada. Sorry, Marilyn. We'll work on that. Yeah. You never know. And so I grew up in Washington, D.C., in town. Usually people don't believe me. Where are you really from? Really? 700,000 people live there. I'm one of them. And on my father's side, I'm a fifth generation Washingtonian, so major snob factor there. So yes, grew up in town and grew up at a place called St. Columba's Episcopal Church, which is obviously a big part of probably why I'm sitting here. And I always like to tell the story, especially Cate and I baptized 6 little ones in here a couple weeks ago, and at our baptismal preparation meeting, I sort of said, I think it's helpful for you to know that lots of people who come to bring their kids to be baptized sometimes feel very sheepish about their motives. It's like, well, we haven't really been to church, but now we want to, and I don't know if we'll be here that often. And it's a lot of hemming and hawing, and I think sometimes the church can do a disservice by pretending that somehow people are going to magically be here all the time. And I just always think it's helpful to say that I'm one of those kids. I mean, my mom grew up in the Episcopal Church. My dad sort of was a lapsed Unitarian, which is lapsed theologically. I mean, so there was no vision, sort of like the Simeon, this child will be great. It's like, what? People like John, who I tease, is a double priest kid, PK. No clergy in my family. There were tons of expectations from like my grandfather that maybe I would go into the family business, which on my dad's side of the family was like going into the State Department or the State Department that might have had an office in Langley, Virginia, or government work of some kind. Someone just randomly showed up at my parents' house when I was like 4 or 5 months old, asking her to sign a petition for some playground or something, and then she also had some sort of said something about church. My mom said, "Oh yeah, I think we need to get our kid baptized. Where do you go to church?" And it was just the local Episcopal church, and then the rest is history. So I just think it's interesting. You know, I'm someone who grew up in church and just sort of kept walking through doors that I think God was opening or pointing me towards. So I am someone who was starting to discern a vocation early. I was sort of your super young person, and acolyte, sacristan, youth group person, and then had a lot of adults at a young age who were really encouraging me. So I pursued that all the way to where I went to college, which was Sewanee. I went to the college at Sewanee, so you've got both ends of the university represented here, and had a great experience there. Did more discernment, and then went to Yale before Cate, right after college, and was there for 3 years, and then was an assistant at a church in Atlanta, Georgia for 2 years, and then was in a relationship with someone who we tried to move together all the way to LA, to the West Coast. That relationship ended up sort of breaking up right before I moved, which I still chose to move. I wasn't exactly moving to Siberia. I was moving to the beach in LA, so hard call, but someone has to do it. So
From Hotlanta.
from Hotlanta, yeah, it was better. And then was there for about 3 years before coming to St. Stephen's. So,
What do you do for fun, Will?
fun, work. No, I'm just kidding. No. These two try to, and Pat too, and Claudia for that matter, all try to keep me accountable to preserve a life of some kind. I do play golf, which has gotten some press lately. Through the golf tournament, we did not win, but we'll cheat next year and we'll win. So don't worry. I play golf. I like food. I'm not very good at creating food like Cate, but I'm very good at eating what Cate so lovingly creates, and a good glass of wine or a good cocktail. Those are also good. So.
And great conversation.
Great conversation. Yeah. I'm a talker, as someone who talked the longest of those three, you all can tell.
So Will started talking a bit about his discernment of vocation. So let's dive into that a little bit more and talk about what God's call to you to the priesthood, and kind of what that felt like, and what that call was like for each of you as you move through adulthood and then ultimately to seminary and ordination. John, why don't you start, and we'll
Sure.
bounce around some
Well,
here.
this is a great topic because as I said, I think Will had such clarity. I don't know. I'm curious. I don't think I've heard you talk too much about this. I was very muddled. My mother was not ordained until 1997, and that's the year I graduated from VMI. So she waited. She felt her call back in the early 70s. But she had small children, and we didn't ordain women then. And so she held it until it was time. And in her mind, the time was when I went to college and was settled. And so I got out of college, and so then she was ordained. My father died when I was 8 years old. And so for a long time, I felt both secure and alive in church life. But I wasn't confident that this was my call. Was I just trying to find my father or learn more, better identify with who he was via the church? And so that was a long struggle. And when we had our interviews, one of the interviews with the vestry for this parish, what was the restaurant, the lounge down here, just 2 blocks down, that's gone now?
Katura.
No, the city. Jim's something, or? Yeah, it's where the Continental is now. Anyway, so probably about 20 years ago now, my wife and I, were we married? I can't remember if we were married or still dating at that time, but we were sitting there, and I said, Bess, I think I'm called to ordination. And she said, well, of course you are. And I said, well, I'm not sure when, but anyway, so that was the first time I sort of articulated that out loud. And one of the ways that discernment works is it starts at this very deep private level, and then it moves out to one other person. And at every stage, more and more people are involved, and it becomes more and more risky. More and more people have to agree that there's a call or hear a call. So I would say, and I'll wrap this up, that as I went through some challenges in life and some unhappiness in different vocations, that I kind of had to try everything else first and come to the realization that what I originally thought, my gut was right. And that this is the place where my life is most fully lived in relationship with God and with God's people. And I really held on to the belief that, well, ordination is something no fun. It's dour and it's this and that. And if I do it, I'll have to give up the fun things. So I need to do the fun things first. And I could not have been more wrong. This is the most fun thing. This is the most joyful and real and alive thing I know.
Thank you. Will?
I would just add that I think there was a person who helped me when I was discerning, because I did some inner struggle around sort of my voice versus God's voice and hearing voices in your head. You know, there's certain parts of the world where you start talking about voices in your head, they lead you in other directions, not to seminary. So, and I had a spiritual director type person in my life who said, and I was worried about having integrity and being authentic in this. And that person basically said, you know, if you're wrestling with those questions, you're probably on the good path already. People who are like narcissists or delusional don't wonder, is this real? They just are gung-ho, plowing all the way ahead. So that was helpful for me. I did discern early. Cate and I especially have talked a lot over our work together here around how much we both can talk. I'll let Cate speak in her own words about how the church can be a place where people of all ages are given a sense of identity and safety to discern whatever God is doing in their life. And that those kind of questions, whoever is asking them, are honored, that are not given a sort of patronizing look, and that leadership and that people of all ages are really trusted with leadership, from the youngest to the oldest. And that's really the church at its best does that. And I'm the testament to someone who was given leadership at a young age and not talked down to, and given the freedom to explore who I was and all the fullness that it was. And even though I went to seminary right after college, I've admitted now that I could have learned things from taking some time off. I'm also really happy, and I'm really lucky that I was able to be in an environment that helped me discern at a young age what it was that I was called to do in this life. And I got ordained to the priesthood at the age of 25. I turned 26 like a day later, 2 weeks later, and I've been doing it for almost 7 years now. So 7 to go, 7 in, 23 to go. It's some days I have a clock. 23 years, okay.
Well, at least you started early.
Well,
we're ordained at the exact same time. We're on the same ordination path. Yeah.
Kate?
I grew up in Delaware. My family went to a church called Christ Church Christiana 100. And when we were moving to Delaware was also when my parents got divorced. And Christ Church was the place that did not change from week to week. We had a 50-50 joint custody split, so on Tuesdays we switched houses. And I lived out of a pomegranate box from Costco for, 10 years. And church was the place that was reliably the same, and was the place where I could be sort of all mixed up about all of these things that were happening, and there was language and understanding. So it was always a very comfortable place. My father was a very, very devout Episcopalian, as was his mom, and so I grew up with a dad who was a senior warden and who brought me to church all the time, and just sort of church was a comfortable place, and I knew that it was for me. And I was 14 the first time I started talking about a call to the ministry, and like Will, had a lot of adults who took me really seriously at an impossibly young age. As a 29-year-old now, I look back at that and I think, holy cow, what were they doing? I hope I remember enough to respond that way if a 14-year-old comes up to me and says the same thing. And I really love a plan and love to have control. And so I was like, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to finish high school. I'm going to go to college. I'll take off 1 year, because they really like it when you take off 1 year. And then I'll go to seminary. And I did that until I got to that 1 year in Chicago. And then really had the only instance I've ever had of like a voice in my head where at the very beginning of my service corps year, I thought, well, what if I didn't go to seminary next year? And then I thought, well, that wasn't me asking that. I would never ask such a thing. And then ended up staying in Chicago for 3 years, which was just a gift and necessary to me. And could have stayed for longer. And I was in process in the Diocese of Delaware. And left it because something I've learned is that it is sometimes really hard to go back to the place that raised you after you've grown up a little bit. I know some people can, and it's just not something I have a capacity for. So I went to college and changed a little, and went to Chicago and started changing more, and found that my community in Delaware was my home, but was not necessarily a place that could really discern with sort of openness, not because anyone was bad, but because they had sort of watched me come up and were like, yeah. And I was saying, well, actually, but I want there to be the door that says no, just in case. I think we need to have this door. So I left the process for a while, but eventually started again in Chicago. And that brought me to here. And I think I feel so grateful to have such a sort of broad community of people who said yes at lots of different points. People who've known me since I was 11, who when I got ordained had been waiting with me just as long, and people, Will came with me to get ordained and he'd known me for like 3 days and still sort of was saying yes so adamantly, and I just feel the night before I got ordained as a deacon, I was crying and crying and crying. I love to cry, so it's not super surprising, but I was just really overcome. And my best friend said, why? What are your tears about? And when I finally could find the words, it was just, I feel so astonished that God would have chosen me for this, and I can't believe it, and I'm so grateful. And I feel that most days still. I hope I don't stop.
Good, thank you. So we're going to go to one of the questions from the audience, and I'm going to adapt it just a little bit. What so far has been your biggest surprise as an ordained person? Will, your biggest surprise?
My public answer, my private answer.
Will, pull your mic down towards your...
Okay.
It's at your eyeball.
It's like at your eyeball.
You need to pinch it down.
Oh, there it is. Yeah. I see. Usually people can, yeah. My biggest surprise as an ordained person, I think helpful for sort of, so, because people will read into this, he's talking about so-and-so at St. Stephen's. No, not necessarily. I think I have been surprised at the ways, I've talked about this with all of these folks and Claudia here. I've been surprised, this has been true here and been true other places, that the vast majority, 96% of people, do not look at me as someone who could be their grandson. And sort of, they might be a comment here or there. Usually it's about like how attractive I am or something, which is great, but like,
How charming.
how charming, all that stuff. Oh, please. But seriously, I think the joke we say, clergy say about the reason why the collar is blank is so that it can hold all of everyone's projections. Because we do, we sort of, clergy are sign and symbol in a community that help the community understand who it is. And that means you both are praised, that is not really founded in reality, getting too much credit for certain things, and I think critiqued in ways that aren't really about you. And it's not about you. You have to be able to hold that both when it's like you're the best, which doesn't mean you're awful, but I'm just trying to be faithful. I'm doing my job. Versus you're the worst. Well, it's really not about you. So I've been surprised at the ways in which I've been in 4 parishes as a priest. This is my 4th, and all of them, Atlanta, coast of LA, Beverly Hills, California, Richmond, Virginia, not exactly the same 4 places, to say the least, that I've been constantly surprised in a very positive way that people, if people have a sense that you care about them and love them, they don't care what age you are, or whatever your circumstances are, or whatever your sense of identity markers are. And I think if people have a sense that you don't love them, they're not going to connect with you. And that has nothing to do with age or orientation or gender or anything. So the extent to which people, hopefully, if I have communicated that I care about them, and I'll just say that is hard. You can't do that instantly, and it's harder to do in a larger parish because people will have less of a personal relationship with you. And pandemic, whoa, throw that in there. And yet, I think that a lot of the faces in the congregation, I know some of your stories, the fact that we've been through this together and through other challenges has a way of bringing us together. And now we're just finally getting the chance to kind of catch up with the normal ways. It's a little bit like dating. You're like catching up with the normal ways of getting to know one another. So that's been a really, for all of my jokes about public-private answer, it's actually a really encouraging surprise.
Good. Kate, why don't you go next?
In seminary, and as a hospital chaplain, I was taught that my role was to receive people's stories, but not to give back my own story, if that makes sense. Especially in a hospital, like there's not enough time, so it's just to sort of be companion to someone pastorally, but not to make it about me or to tell of myself. And as many of you probably know, my dad died the day after I moved to Richmond last year. And I, for a while, was like, that's how it's got to be. Like, there's a wall, I don't tell, like, I just kept saying I'm fine. And Joan was like, are you, though, really? I don't really believe you, eventually. It took, about 2 months after. And, of course, the answer was that I was not. And what I've learned from that moment and sort of letting myself be honest with all of you is that the pastoral relationship is mutual in some ways. It's not it's not necessarily equal, but there is, like, you also care for me. And that has surprised me in the best way. I'd never worked in a parish really before, so I didn't know what it would be like to stay somewhere and to be here, I hope, for a long time, and to sort of really bring the fullness of myself and what's happening, and learn how to build that kind of trust that lets you hold it too. And it's just been such an expansion of what I understood Christian community to be, and I feel so loved, and I love you so much. So it's just really, I think seminaries, in a bid to be really careful at the ways and to train pastors not to take advantage of the power we are given by being clergy. I think they don't fully portray what the pastoral relationship looks like. And I would not have made it through to now and last year without the care I received. So I'm really grateful to have been surprised this way.
Thank you. John?
If you'd asked me the same question on another day, that you might have a different answer. But as some of you, if you were, I'm not asking for a show of hands who was here yesterday, or Sunday, but I preached on one of the passages where Jesus speaks about marriage, and there's no question that in my experience of the church, ordained in the same amount of time as Will, But I was at St. Paul's Episcopal in Augusta, Georgia. So that one place I landed. And almost left a few different times, but that's a different story. This is a little personal, but I went through a 6-month separation while I was in seminary, and that is exceedingly rare. Not really according to the playbook. But our family believed that our best chance to heal and move forward was not to leave and start over and then come back another day, possibly. And we had to fight for that, and we were given permission to stay in seminary and work through that. But where that led a few years down the road was that I informed the bishop that we had made the decision to, in fact, divorce the day before the ordination, so that there was the opportunity to say no. But given everything they knew and everything we had done, they said yes. Now here's the surprise about the church. I was new in this community. I'd been in that church for 6 months at that point, because I had my diaconal ordination, and then this is 6 months later. So Thanksgiving week will be my 7th anniversary to ordination. And I was, and continue to be, surprised by the compassion. There is sort of a faux compassion, there's a distanced compassion, and then there's where people just immediately know the pain that someone is experiencing, and there is nothing more Christian than that, and saying, I'm so sorry, and I've experienced this too, or I've been through something like this, all kinds of things. And in our case, I had to send a public letter out to the parish. So it wasn't just, this is happening, it's, let me tell this whole community, this is happening, and see how that plays out. And you never know. It could have gone very differently. But so my surprise was that Christian community embraced and rallied around, and I think in many ways that you experienced in your loss of your father, the parish rallied around me to support me as a young, new priest. And that is utterly formative in the kind of priest I am today.
Thank you. Well, let's switch gears a little. And John, let's stay with you for this. So these three, you've heard about their length of ordination. They're all young. So you're looking at the future of the church right here, right? And future leaders, already leaders, but future leaders as they grow in their ministry. So let's talk about the future of the church a little bit. What's the future of the big church look like? And let's just stick with the Christendom, or at least the Episcopal Church. What do each of you see as, let's say, the biggest challenge and the biggest exciting thing and the thing that concerns you moving forward as leaders of the next 20, 30 years of the church? Big question.
That's easy. So I think the thing that concerns me most, and it's easier to start there, is where, and I'm every bit as guilty of this as anybody can be, is holding on to what we know rather than leaning into what's actually happening in the moment. And we've seen this manifest in so many ways during the pandemic, of just demanding that we do what we, as a culture, we want to go back. We want to go back. And this is the second law of thermodynamics. There is no going back. There is no such thing as time travel that goes backwards. Time only moves in one direction, and it is ever changing. The only status of anything that does not change is death. And so the churches, as I've alluded to in the sermon Sunday, we live in an incredibly complex time where it's ever more complex, and trying to be simple or hold on to things that we just know because that's what makes us comfortable is, I think, the risk to the church, the risk to the world. We have to be as present as we can be to what is actually happening to the human beings around us, wherever we are, and be responsive based on what we each understand about the gospel. And I have faith that when we do that, new things emerge that we could never have dreamed of, and that the future of the church is being exceedingly close to what's actually happening in reality, rather than focused on what we've always known.
Good, thank you. Will, you going to let Kate go?
Go. You want me to go? Why?
You're better at it.
You
You
want
took
the
your
last
mask off, so.
I think he's
So I think Christendom is dead, doesn't exist anymore. Say a funeral for it.
Okay, unpack that a little bit.
No. What I mean by that is Christendom is this notion that like everyone's Christian, kind of. I mean, in so many words, and I think that so I before I came to St. Stephen's, I was on the West Coast for 3 years, and I'm very grateful for that experience because, and this is not about being super lefty or super righty, just the reality. California, there is really no church-going culture there. That's helpful because that will be Richmond in 15, 25, 30 years. It will. I will bet all the money in my pockets that that's true because that's a societal move, and that's a move away from Christendom, which assumes that everyone goes to church or is Christian. And you know what? I'm here to tell you very clearly, that is gospel. That is good news. Because if we place our faith and our trust and are holding on to we are relevant because we exist, that is a path that does not lead to as much abundant life as we are claimed by Jesus Christ. We place our trust in him. He is the head of the church, and we are servants. We are baptized in his name. And I do think that actually is the church recovering a sense of its sort of missionary identity in a time, because we remember the church was not birthed in a time when everyone was Christian. It was birthed in a time when they were a persecuted minority sect that had to meet in secret. And I also, because I get this a lot as, I'm not the youngest person on the stage, but pretty close, is, and this is going to show up, it's probably worth addressing now in the search process, the discernment process for calling of new rector. This community, because of its size and complexity, will not feel these effects as quickly as pretty much any other Episcopal church in the country. So that's in some ways good news, but it's only a delaying of the reality, which means that we here have time. And that is really good news, I think, because facing these challenges are hard, and the more that we can trust and understand that the shedding of the understanding that we're kind of the dominant culture, the more that we can all contend that that is actually leading towards an abundant life, because it gets us closer to how the church sort of historically has been. And lots of parts of the world, Christianity is not the dominant religion. So we're now coming into terms with the rest of the world. I also want to say, people like my age are not, the vast majority are not going to come to church because that's what you do. That is a lie. I promise you, take it to the bank. These people are my friends. They will come to church if there's some abundant life going on there. That's what gets them out of their beds in the morning. That's what gets them to make choices over lacrosse practice and other things. So let's get really good about that, about what we're offering, who we are, and that our identity is not rooted in we've always been here, but in Jesus Christ, who's the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So that's a challenge, but it's also a hope.
Well said. Kate?
I mean, I don't know
Yeah,
what to say after that.
You got the most powerful last word.
I've never felt called to parish ministry in the long term. I've been surprised by how much I've loved this, and I also have been affirmed in my sense that I am not called to be the rector of a place like this, or probably many other places, and I am not called to be a vicar. That's just not the gifts that I have. So it's very easy for me to imagine a church that doesn't look like this, because I know that that is where I'm called. I think I've talked to some of you about wanting to plant a restaurant church, or wanting to plant a community really focused on doing reconciliation work and conflict mediation, or a community where we're just really honest that the world kind of looks like it's falling apart right now, and where we learn to be really responsible stewards of Christian hope. And I don't know exactly what the concrete realities of that look like, but I do imagine that as we continue into 5 years and 10 years and 20 years from now, that the church is going to stop looking like buildings, and is going to start, I think, once again looking like a community of people who don't have maybe as many tangible places to sit or to leave their books, but who have one another, and who have Jesus. I have also been surprised as a new priest by how little we talk about Jesus. And I do think Will is right that we're going to have to start doing that more and more if we want to last 5 more years or longer. And I think there's also a lot of hope in letting go of what we imagine and knowing that God has always imagined even bigger and better than we can. And it's also really scary. I think we might be in a time of ending, but the thing that we know as Christians is that endings and death are not actually the end. So if we can sort of remain together even through that, I think we'll find that the church has become something that might seem totally foreign, but also will be quite fun and beautiful in what we need.
Good. I'm going to make a little editorial comment here that as a person who's in the last years of my ordained ministry and at least active, I've been ordained over 29 years, and finding the gears slowing down a little bit. What gives me hope for the church and for the future of ministry is to hear young people talking about Jesus like these 3 do. That's what we're about. And the fact that they do it so well and so clearly and so passionately and so personally is a great sign for all of us, I think. Will, were you going to say something else?
Yeah, I think it's because we focus sort of, and I sort of alluded to the St. Stephen's incarnation of these larger realities. These two tease me all the time. Pat as well sometimes. I really like my job. And one thing I'm really proud of is like how we've assembled a team. And I think it's worth saying publicly, besides Pat, obviously the 3 of us are here, we're called by Gary Jones. I mean, we're one of his legacies here, along with a bunch of lay staff and really top-notch people who come to work every day, who are really faithful and committed, who are smart, who are collegial, and obviously we're in a time of some uncertainty with a rector search and the like. But I love the ability to try to help an institution like this, which is big and complex and complicated in some ways and wonderful. A place that is a resource parish. We've been talking about that. Pat talked about that in the forum. People who have generations and generations of stories and witness, and a place that has folks, a lot of you who fit in that category, with folks who are brand new here. And the fact that all that's going on in one place is really exciting and is rare in the Episcopal Church. So that's one reason why I'm not going anywhere personally or professionally. But I also think that this place, again, has the ability to take a couple risks to help the whole church, the Episcopal Church, the larger Christian community, move forward in that way. And I also think it's very helpful, especially for folks to hear that we don't do this from a sort of flippant way. Like, we understand, I understand how scary that is, and how we wrestle with change has frustrated and caused people to doubt in every generation. And like, one of my big things as someone who's 32, I think sometimes we have sort of said in culture, like, the last frontier of like acceptance has come. The Holy Spirit is always leading us into truths and truths we cannot yet bear. That's what Jesus is talking about. So there's always going to be some new frontier. But I know some of your stories in this room, you all have faced so many frontiers. And you did it with such grace and love and faithfulness. And so the Christian community is always about that.
Indeed.
And we'll be fine if we stick together and keep our eyes fixed on what matters.
Excellent. So let's just continue that. Thank you, John and Kate. If y'all would talk specifically about St. Stephen's. And Joan, I don't know if you could move, while they're doing that, if you could move through and see if there are any more index card questions that we could look at real quick. But so talk specifically about your vision of the future St. Stephen's, somewhat like Will did, if you would.
Sure. I think that there's so much possible here. I think we are so well-resourced. Like, we are both a resource to the church, but also have so many resources for ourselves. And I just think there's a lot of spaces to really try new stuff. And maybe it works, and maybe it won't work. But I think the gift of this kind of, this particular parish with its size and how many people, is that if we try something that doesn't work, it won't be devastating. It won't be the end of us. If you're in a much smaller parish and all of your energy goes into putting something new together and it doesn't work, that's really, really hard. But because we're so large, I think we are afforded real opportunities for creativity. I mentioned a restaurant church. I knew you had a cafe when I came here, and part of my desire to come was sort of like, wow, they already did all the hard part, and now there's like a cafe, and so imagining what could we use that space for. I've done dinner church before, which is when we have the Eucharist around tables during a meal, in the way the early church did. We could use it as a space for the arts. We could use it as a gathering place for small group dinners, forum conversations. We could get really nutty and take out all the pews and use this space for all sorts of different things. I'm not saying we will, but just there's like a lot of, I just saw people shaking their heads. I know. I'm sorry. But just all that to say, I think there's a lot of really tangible, creative opportunity. And coming out of the pandemic, I think those spaces are even more wide open. And my goal for us in the next year, and my hope for a new rector, is that we'll find ourselves in new relationship with someone who isn't afraid to try and sometimes to fail. I hope y'all will come to Palmer Tent sometime, because for me that's a space where I'm like, well, let's just try it this way this week. And then, I said this morning, yeah, that didn't work. Good to try it, and it didn't work out. But I just think that's the future of the church, is sort of letting go of that need for it to be quite so stable. Because what is stable is Jesus and the promise of new life. And that means everything else can sort of be tested and tried and put aside and picked back up if it's in the name of serving that resurrection and Easter truth.
Good. John?
Yeah, it's interesting what brings each of us here. I'm completely surprised. I mean, I've never been somebody who thought, oh, I want to go work in a resource parish, or I'm just completely surprised that this all emerged the way it did, and that I'm sitting here. But and when I submitted my cover letter to Will, Mr. Stanley, well, you know, where Pat and I come from, it's Father Wingo, right?
Yes, Father.
Yeah.
Yep.
Father John.
Mother Cate.
Yeah, but here it's Mr. So
Mr. Stanley.
Virginia. We are in Virginia now. So, but I wrote very clearly, the position was my primary portfolio here is focusing on youth ministry and developing that in an intentional way. And at a breakneck speed, I'm looking at a 5-year buildup, okay? This is not, how do we get there by, in 6 months or 12 months and we have a huge, But what attracted me here is really what Gary's work with the Celtic service, the space that created, and it's an early example of what Cate's talking about and what Will's talking about, of having the courage to do something that has not been done before and adapt it, and not just do it one way, but keep trying and adapting to find where's the most life in this. Do you know how many ministries, for example, are tied just to the Celtic service? I mean, an enormous number of people pour hours in every week to make that 1 hour happen. It's the same for every liturgy, but they're different people. It's not just the same people doing things. But that contemplative movement, that space where people can engage a different way of being human rather than doing, and this is what my mother spoke about Sunday night, about the God's call to us is about being, not about doing. And this is a church that it's the only church I mean, there are others, but there is a critical mass of people in this community, in this particular parish, who are open to another way of being human, to a degree and depth that I'm not aware of elsewhere, and for there to be a place for that in the church, and a place for beautiful common prayer worship, and a place for feeding, and a place for a dinner pair. I mean, there's this great opening in a book I've been reading, and at the very opening, this is a little bit of a different side story, but it's important, I think. At the very opening, there's a philosopher, and he's telling a story about the mid to late 60s. He's with a bunch of students at Stanford, and they're all just as angry about the war and as liberal as they can be, and they're just pulling America apart and saying, nothing here is worth saving. This is, the 60s. And they're at the home of this expat, a British expat. And at the end, they've all sort of said their piece, all these, angry 20-somethings said their piece, and they turn to him and they say, well, what do you think about America? And he just leans back in his chair, and he looks at them, and he says, you don't know what you've got. You don't know what you've got here. You've got something that has never happened before in the history of human existence. A nation, a church, a people who are bound together by their ideas and their hopes, not by their king, not by their power or their vainglory, or the aristocratic, Habsburgs who owned everything. And I think the church is like that here. That we even as much as we appreciate St. Stephen's and love it, we don't know what we've got. And this concept of a village green and a new abbey that can be open and available for the city, not just for St. Stephen's, the city, is so special, and we need to make the absolute most we can of it. And we do that by using the gifts and the passions we have. And we each have different gifts and passions, and you each have different gifts and passions. So let's pursue them.
Well, amen, John Jenkins.
Wow, John Jenkins, damn, son.
So we're coming to the end of our time, but I don't know if Will and Cate, if y'all want to add to what John has just said, or any final words. I think John said that well, but any final words from either of you?
I think John sort of hinted on this. I think one of the great, as a method or a sort of path forward that I think this place has really taught the rest of the Episcopal Church and the wider church is that I believe, and I think this is the method that's been sort of held and walked here, is one of expansion. It's not one of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, sort of reactionary change. Because, and this is sort of, the debates in, and Kate and I have had a lot of conversation about this, where we both went to school, and Swanee does this as well, because I used to live there, has, I think, a way forward in this time when there's lots of diversity and pluralism and change. It's to be really clear about what's the essential, and then to be slightly more okay with the other things that aren't the essentials, having some flexibility. But it's not about saying there are no more essentials. And so this place, like, I'm really proud that within the span of 12 hours, we have a Rite One Eucharist here, and then 9, 11:15, Palmer Hall, tent, outdoor, the Celtic service, and then Compline, which is like a super ancient service. And that's a sort of kaleidoscope of all kinds of things that have their own integrity. So we don't try to go for like the bland middle, where everything's sort of neutered, if you will. So like, for instance, where Kate and I went to school, there's a lot of intentionality around saying, we're not just gonna look for gender neutral language for God, like God, because we never wanna say God's a he. Because the Bible has like 475,000 ways to talk about God. Some of it is very masculine, some of it is not. And I think the way forward is not to say, get rid of all that masculine language, we're past that. It's to say, let's talk about all the language for God, because God is obviously not some old white guy with a beard in the sky. So it's all of this language. So I think a path forward that is clear, that's faithful, but also open to new, is kind of leaning on what has been done here of being expansive. Because that also helps honor folks that, people who love a traditional service have to have a place here. And not just those people, and they're kind of old-fashioned, but like honored and celebrated for who they are. And other people are honored and celebrated for who they are. And that kind of way forward is I think, I think that's what Jesus did. He didn't go around saying you need to be this one way. He went around and sort of honored people and who they are, especially when society was saying, well, get rid of those people, we don't need them. He was always sort of challenging that.
And I think our next work, our most immediate work, is drawing together, even as we have these different sort of places where we reside in this community. It's viewing that middle not as a space of nothingness, but actually as the place where we all find ourselves meeting, and knowing that that space is hard sometimes. It's really hard to sort of sit with people who don't agree with you, who don't want the church to look the same as you, who do prefer a totally different worship style than you do, or maybe don't even think of Jesus the same way. But instead of being afraid, it's drawing together in that space, building relationship, finding that solid ground that we live on, even in the middle of the tension, and knowing that that middle space is where the Holy Spirit is the most active, and that is where transformation happens, and that is where new life comes from, not sort of being in siloed communities within a larger community, but in that place where we all sort of collide together, and it's totally chaotic. But we know from the very beginning that chaos is what God makes new life out of.
With that, I think we're done. We appreciate the opportunity to do this, and we hope that we can continue to have interaction with the women of St. Stephen's in any way that works for you all.
Yeah.
Joan?
I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me in the back?
Better get a mic. Yeah.
I know.
That's all right.
That's hard.
I just want to say, wow. I mean, this has been, I think, just wonderful. Couple of things. I want to be sure everybody got their brochures in the mail. If you did not, I have some here in the front, and always will be some out at Information Central. And today you get 10% off in Mayfair House if you want to stop by. So thank you all for coming, and hope to see you in November.